I think this is my first ever interview here. I'm going to put you on gallery view here so everyone can see both of us side by side. My name is Sean Kosofsky. I go by the Nonprofit Fixer, and my company is Mind the Gap Consulting. And I just wanted to do my first ever interview here with Dan Parks because there was some big news this week, and I wanted to make sure that nonprofits got the inside scoop on what just happened in Washington this week. It's not even finally finished yet, but Dan wanted to share with us some stuff that happened on the Hill. So Dan, if you could just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background working in Washington and covering policy and what you do now.
Sure. My name is Dan Parks. I'm a senior editor at the Chronicle of Philanthropy. I've been here for about 6 years. Before that, I worked for Bloomberg News for about 4 years. And before that, I spent about a decade at Congressional Quarterly.
Excellent, excellent. So you've worked on the Hill, covering Congress for a long time and policy. So thanks for that. So I read your story in the Chronicle of Philanthropy this week. Very exciting news. Of course, there's a lot of information happening right now. A lot of people are sort of consumed by news about the coronavirus. They're consumed about news about a lot of things. And there are some big, big swings in terms of money right now. The stock market is all over the place, big drops, big gains. And that of course impacts foundations because foundation endowments right now are probably looking very bleak for the near or long term. Hopefully folks can weather their way through that. But then there's also this week the huge jobless numbers, right? We've never seen a spike in jobless claims like this ever before. So nonprofits are probably looking at all this news and starting to freak out. In the same exact week, a stimulus bill, $2 trillion, nothing ever this big ever passing. So I saw your piece and I wanted you to maybe cover the 4 or 5 biggest items of why this matters to nonprofits. I saw some stuff in there for the Kennedy Center in DC and some sort of like supporting our local nonprofits in DC. But if you could tell us about like maybe the 4 or 5 most significant things, especially for smaller nonprofits like that are impacted by this stimulus bill.
Sure, be happy to. One of the biggest things to happen in the bill was the creation of what's called a universal deduction. Basically, that means that anybody who pays taxes can deduct some charitable giving off of their taxes. Previously, only people who itemized could deduct charitable giving on their taxes. A universal deduction is something that has long been sought by nonprofits, and they really, really, really wanted it after the 2017 tax bill, which roughly doubled the standard deduction. And the upshot of that, obviously, was that far fewer people are now itemizing their taxes, so there's even less incentive for ordinary individuals to give. So extending the charitable deduction to people who don't itemize has always been high on nonprofits' wish lists. And they did get that for 1 year in this bill. It's limited to $300 cash only, does not apply to giving to donor-advised funds. But it is kind of a foot in the door, perhaps. There's already legislation to try to make that legislation permanent, to expand it by raising the cap. So that's one of the top things that nonprofits were able to get in this bill. There's also—
Let me just interrupt you with a question there. So just to remind folks, as you just mentioned, the tax bill that passed in 2017, I think a lot of us have been seeing the data that donations might even be falling across the sector, and that might be attributable to that tax change that happened in 2017. So this universal deduction might incentivize people who are not itemizing to give up to $300, or that they can at least do that. So this is like a new benefit and something that might encourage some giving across the country.
Yeah, certainly. There's a raging debate about that, actually, about the extent to which tax policy affects giving. There are those experts who say that it doesn't really have much impact, that people give out of the goodness of their heart and they don't really think much about tax implications. There are others who say that's nonsense, and I've seen data on both sides of that equation.
Right.
I don't think we've established yet what the impact of that 2017 law is yet.
Got it. Thank you. Go on with the other parts of the bill.
The other major parts of the bill were one other major impact was to create SBA loans for nonprofits. That's something that nonprofits didn't have access to in the past, but now nonprofits of up to a certain size are eligible for loans of up to $10 million through the SBA, and those loans, the Small Business Administration, and those loans could be forgiven in a lot of cases, particularly if nonprofits retain workers. That's obviously one of the key goals of the legislation. The overall, the stimulus legislation is to get businesses and nonprofits to maintain their workforces through this hopefully brief economic downturn. That's
So,
limited.
so on that perk, up to $10 million for organizations with under 500 staff. And if you keep your workers through June, the loan might be forgiven. So it's just like a big gift if they end up being able to keep their workers in the workforce, right?
It is. It's potentially a huge benefit if you can maintain your workforce through a rough patch here. Yes, it essentially turns a loan into a grant. Yes.
Excellent. Sorry, go on.
Sure. There are also some new provisions expanding incentives for corporate giving. And I can get into the details of that if you'd like. I don't know how relevant those are going to be. I don't know that corporations are going to be jacking up their giving in the current environment when many of them are fighting for their lives. But it is something that Congress decided to include in the bill.
Yeah, I do have a friend who runs a nonprofit here in the Bay that works on personal finance. She's one of those few bright spots in the nonprofit sector where lots of financial organizations are connecting with her to move them lots of money because they have a direct way of getting resources into people's checking accounts very quickly. So that's one of those rare examples in this environment where companies are actually stepping up. But I think you're right. They're going to be holding on for dear life. I have a lot of friends in the corporate world, executives who are like just trying to keep the doors open right now. So yeah, the corporate elements of this might not end up being as interesting or end up manifesting themselves, but who knows? You're right. So no need to go into the details on the corporate ones. What other perks did you see in the bill?
The other big items would be the refundable payroll tax credit of up to $5,000 per employee. And again, that's contingent upon keeping employees on the payroll. Those are the major items.
Excellent. And who were the main advocates? Like a lot of people in the nonprofit sector, I think they're sort of oblivious to who's fighting for them on the Hill, right? Like what lobbyists of what organizations were going to bat. I think there were some calls for a giant stimulus from United Way, right? But like who was actually in Washington pushing for these things to make their way into the final stimulus? And was there any resistance, and who was pushing for them?
Mm-hmm. The National Council of Nonprofits was one major sort of umbrella group that was pushing for a lot of these changes. Independent sector is another one. And you mentioned some of the bigger nonprofits, United Way, Goodwill, lots. I mean, anybody who anybody, all the major players in the nonprofit sector were pushing for this legislation and a lot more. Now, I think you could say that they did pretty well, that nonprofits did pretty well. After the 2017 tax law, there was a lot of talk in the nonprofit world that the lobbyists and the advocates for nonprofit really took a beating. The tax bill, as I mentioned before, doubled the standard deduction, lots of efforts to try to offset the impact of that. None of those came to pass. So in this legislation, I was actually a little bit surprised to see that nonprofits did as well as they did after the losses they took in 2017.
Yeah, so when a crisis like this happens, you just never know when people are going to pull together. And this looks like it was almost universally bipartisan, right? Was there any dissent in the Senate, or I think today's the vote in the House? Was there any dissent from anyone in Washington on the nonprofit part of this or the entire stimulus bill?
No dissent on the nonprofit part that I'm aware of. And by the way, the House did just clear this for the president's signature, and the president may have already signed it. He's promised to sign it very quickly. So it's through Congress. There was a little Republican opposition in both chambers that held up the bill briefly in the Senate. The Senate did pass it unanimously on Wednesday, and the House passed it on a voice vote today. But those votes both came a little later than people were anticipating, but they were held up by Republicans concerned about other provisions of the bill, not those that were particularly for nonprofits.
Excellent. And I was just going to ask my final question, whether there were any surprises in the process or in the final bill. You kind of alluded to the fact that you thought it was surprising that nonprofits fared so much better this time than the last time there was a major tax reform. But was there anything else surprising through the process as nonprofits were jockeying to take advantage of this moment to help bolster the sector?
Nothing beyond what I've mentioned. Like I said, I think the inclusion of the universal deduction was a big win for nonprofits, not just because they got a 1-year universal deduction, but I think it really kind of opens the door for them to maybe push for that to be extended permanently, and maybe the cap be raised above $300. And again, making nonprofits eligible for SBA loans. If you know how things work in Washington, once something is given out, it's often hard to reel it back. So I think nonprofits have to be pleased that they may have gotten some things here that are going to not just get them through the current crisis, but things they might be able to, through successful lobbying, to get those things extended permanently.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, and thanks for putting some color on this for folks. I know it's easy to get lost in the flurry of news headlines happening because of both public health and the stock market and the jobless claims this week and all this other, and a presidential primary that's going on around the country. So being able to get people some straight talk on this on video is really helpful. So if folks wanted to reach out to you or the Chronicle of Philanthropy, how would they do that? Twitter or your website? How would they reach you?
Twitter is fine, although there's quite a flood on Twitter. Sometimes things get missed. I shouldn't say sometimes, a lot of the time. I'm happy to give up my personal email address. It's dan.parks, dan.parks @philanthropy.com. You can reach out to me directly. A little pitch here. Would love for you to subscribe to our emails. You can go to philanthropy.com and find our daily emails, our weekly summaries. Most of those are free. We have had a huge response from nonprofits over the last few weeks. They're really gobbling up our content, and we're happy to see it. And most of our coronavirus-related coverage, we've moved it outside the paywall because we know how important it is to people to have that information this time.
I'm an avid consumer of nonprofit related news, probably 20 blogs and 20 different subscriptions. And my nonprofit that I work at by day, we have a subscription to a number of services, including philanthropy.com, Chronicle of Philanthropy. So thank you. I think that all the work you do to keep the world informed is really important. So for all the people that don't say thank you, thank you. And thanks for joining us today and for educating some of the folks through my firm. So thank you so much. Have a great weekend.
Thank you. Stay safe.
Thanks.